The desert night was restless, the air inside the forward operating base thick with the cloying mixture of dust, diesel fumes, and the faint, metallic bite of gun oil. The base wasn't much to look at, just a scattering of concrete bunkers, a few hastily erected sandbagged walls, and a single runway barely long enough for supply aircraft to risk a landing. But tonight, it had become a desperate refuge for a Navy SEAL team that was bleeding, exhausted, and dangerously close to being completely overrun. The men had staggered back from a mission that hadn't just gone wrong, it had imploded. What was supposed to have been a clean, covert extraction had devolved into a running nightmare. They had fought their way through a series of escalating ambushes, navigated fields of improvised explosives, and endured a relentless enemy pursuit that had hounded them for miles. By the time they stumbled back through the flimsy gates of the base, they were down to their last magazines, some carrying their wounded, others too physically and emotionally drained to even speak. But their eyes said everything. This fight wasn't over. The enemy was regrouping in the dark, and it was only a matter of time before they came crashing down on the base with overwhelming force. Inside a dimly lit command room, the SEAL captain stood hunched over a scarred wooden table covered in topographical maps and crackling radio equipment. His face was hard, worn with the deep lines of a man who had spent years in combat, but the shadows around his eyes revealed more than just age. They showed the crushing weight of command, the unbearable burden of having other men's lives tied directly to his decisions. Around him, his operators shifted uneasily, their movements tight with adrenaline and fatigue as they checked their weapons, exchanged tense whispers, and tried to mask the exhaustion that was setting in deep in their bones. The captain knew what they all knew. They weren't going to be able to hold this position for long without immediate air support. On the ground, SEALs were masters of their craft. They could fight, maneuver, and improvise with lethal efficiency. But when the sheer numbers turned against them, when the enemy had armored vehicles, mortars, and endless waves of fresh fighters, they needed the sky to be on their side. He straightened up, his voice breaking the heavy, suffocating silence. Any combat pilots here? It wasn't a question he ever expected to yield a positive result. This was a SEAL forward operating post, a temporary and austere outpost, not a sprawling air-wing base. His men were trained for water insertions, demolitions, and lightning-fast raids, not for flying complex military aircraft. But desperation was a powerful motivator, and it forced him to ask the impossible question anyway. The room shifted with restless, anxious movement. The operators looked at one another, their expressions grim, shaking their heads slowly. Some lowered their eyes, the silence their only answer. It was enough. The hope that had briefly flickered in the room died just as quickly as it had appeared. Then, from the far end of the room, there was the faint, almost imperceptible sound of a chair scraping lightly against the rough concrete floor. Every head in the room turned. Every pair of eyes fell on someone that few of the SEALs had paid much attention to during their time on the base. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, but she carried herself with a profound stillness that immediately drew notice once the spotlight was on her. She wasn't dressed like them, not in heavy combat kit weighed down with gear and ammunition. She was in standard fatigues, smudged with dust and streaked with grease from the long hours she spent working on the base's failing generators and communications equipment. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hair pulled back in a tight, functional bun. An Air Force patch clung to her shoulder, faded from the sun but unmistakable. Slowly, deliberately, she rose to her feet. "I can fly," she said. The words were calm, unshaken, yet they hit the room with more force than a gunshot. Several of the SEALs frowned, exchanging doubtful, almost scornful glances. It wasn't outright hostility. They had seen enough action to know better than to judge a book by its cover. But skepticism was a survival instinct in their world. Trust wasn't given lightly, and a statement as bold as hers demanded immediate proof. The captain's gaze fixed on her, his eyes narrowing. He said nothing at first, just studied her expression, the way her eyes didn't flicker under the weight of his stare, the way she stood perfectly straight despite the crushing pressure of every gaze in the room. She didn't waver. "What do you fly?" he finally asked, his voice low, testing her. "A-10 Thunderbolt," she replied without a shred of hesitation. The reaction in the room was immediate and palpable. Some of the SEALs muttered under their breath in disbelief. Others looked at her with something approaching genuine surprise. The A-10 was no ordinary aircraft. It was slow and ungainly compared to the sleek fighter jets that dominated the skies, but every single soldier who had ever fought on the ground knew its fearsome reputation. Nicknamed the Warthog, it was a flying tank, a machine built for one singular, brutal purpose: to protect troops locked in a desperate fight. Its primary weapon, a monstrous Gu-8 Avenger cannon, could shred enemy armor and infantry alike with a terrifying ferocity. Ground operators swore by it. When the Warthog was overhead, you lived. The captain's expression shifted, an almost imperceptible change, but it was there. He wasn't a man given to showing emotion, but the faint narrowing of his eyes suggested that for the first time in hours, he saw a sliver of possibility, a glimmer of hope. "You're telling me you can get one of those in the air? From here?" He pressed, his voice still low, challenging her. She nodded once, a single, sharp motion. "There's one on the strip. It's grounded, but its core systems are intact. I can bring it up." The room went quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't born of disbelief. It was the silence of rapid calculation. The SEALs glanced at their captain, waiting for him to weigh the monumental risk. If she was telling the truth, she might be the only chance they had to survive the night. If she was wrong, or unprepared, or simply lying, then sending her up meant losing precious time and lives they couldn't afford to waste. One of the younger SEALs leaned against the wall, muttering just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "She's not even in a flight suit. What's she going to do? Duct tape that bird together and hope for the best?" But his voice carried less bite than he intended it to. That was normal. Hope was dangerous. The captain raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. His gaze never left the young woman. "You realize what you're saying," he said, his tone now somewhere between a direct challenge and a grave warning. "If you're wrong, if you're not what you claim to be, my men die tonight." She didn't flinch. "I know what's at stake." Her voice carried no arrogance, no defensiveness, just an unshakable certainty. Something shifted in the air then. The men in that room might not have known her name, but they recognized that tone. It was the same tone their own captain used when he gave an order that no one dared to question. It was the same tone that seasoned operators carried when they volunteered for impossible missions. It was the voice of someone who understood the consequences and accepted them completely. For the first time, a flicker of genuine respect passed between them. The captain exhaled a long, slow breath, and then gave a curt, decisive nod. "Show me." The room broke into a flurry of movement at once. Radios crackled to life, boots scraped against concrete, and men rushed to prepare for whatever came next. The SEALs were not a unit that dealt in hesitation. Once a decision was made, they moved. Still, the energy was different now. Beneath the skepticism, beneath the bone-deep fatigue, something else was stirring. The possibility of survival. She followed the captain out into the cold night air, the desert wind pulling at the sleeves of her fatigues. The runway lay ahead, faintly lit under a few scattered, sputtering lamps. The dark, hulking silhouette of an aircraft sat at its edge. The A-10 waited like a beast in a deep slumber, its gray paint chipped and battered, its frame scarred, but its presence was undeniable. For a moment, the pilot slowed her steps, letting her hand brush across the rough, cold metal of a nearby Humvee. It had been years since she'd flown in combat, years since she'd heard the thunderous roar of the Avenger cannon directly beneath her, but the memory was etched into her bones. She didn't rise to her feet because she wanted recognition. She rose because she couldn't sit still and watch men fight and die without the cover they so desperately needed. Behind her, the SEAL captain watched her with those unreadable eyes. He had seen countless warriors in his time, the bold ones, the reckless ones, the preternaturally skilled ones. But rarely had he seen someone rise in silence, carry their confidence like a suit of armor, and make hardened men believe in the impossible without ever raising their voice. She hadn't fired a single shot. She hadn't even touched the controls yet. But already, the course of the night was shifting, and all it had taken was 3 words, spoken in a quiet, unwavering tone. "I can fly." The night hummed with a palpable unease. Somewhere in the distance, the sporadic echo of gunfire rolled across the vast, empty desert. The forward operating base was small and acutely vulnerable, a lonely, Forgotten outposts surrounded on all sides by hostile ground. Inside the command bunker, the SEAL captain's words still hung heavy in the air. Any combat pilots here? And she had risen. Now, every single pair of eyes in the dim, crowded room was fixed on her. She wasn't wearing flight gear or a bomber jacket, nothing that would declare her as anything more than another anonymous body stationed at the base. A fresh smudge of oil streaked her forearm, and her boots were scuffed and worn from her maintenance duties. Yet, despite her ordinary, almost invisible appearance, she stood straighter than anyone else in the room, her eyes steady, her voice unervingly calm. I can fly. The silence that followed her statement was sharper than any blade. Some of the younger SEALs scoffed under their breath. Others narrowed their eyes, trying to place her. They had seen her around the base, of course, but they hadn't given her much thought. She was the quiet one who kept to herself, always busy with the base's failing equipment, running communications checks, and performing thankless repairs. She wasn't part of their missions. She wasn't someone they had trained with, sweated with, or bled alongside. And yet, here she was, claiming she could do the one thing that none of them could, the one thing that might just keep them all alive. The captain's face remained an unreadable mask of stone, but his men were less disciplined in their reactions. One SEAL, broad-shouldered with dirt still streaking his face from the earlier firefight, leaned forward. "Ma'am," he said, his tone carrying equal parts disbelief and thinly veiled sarcasm. "With all due respect, you look like you should be fixing our radios, not flying a warthog." A low, uneasy chuckle rippled through the room, but it was forced, hollow. She didn't flinch. Her gaze moved from the skeptical operator back to the captain, her expression unchanging. "I don't look like anything," she stated, her words cutting through the nervous laughter like steel. "I am a combat pilot. You asked if there was one in this room. There is." The SEAL who had spoken sat back, his lips pressing into a tight, hard line. He hadn't expected her to answer so firmly, so directly. The captain's eyes stayed on her, steady, weighing her, assessing her. He wasn't the kind of man to be swayed by mere bravado. He wanted proof. His next question came in a low, even tone, a clear test. "What do you fly?" Her answer came without a moment's hesitation, as though it had been waiting for years to be spoken. A-10 Thunderbolt. The effect of those words was immediate. Even the most vocal doubters fell quiet. Everyone in that room knew the name. The A-10 wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast, sleek, or beautiful like an F-22 or an F-35. But it was something far more important to the men on the ground. It was reliable. It was a machine built specifically for them, for the grunts locked in a desperate fight. It was the aircraft that could fly low, take multiple hits, and just keep fighting. Its GEU-8 Avenger cannon was the stuff of legend, a weapon so powerful it could reduce a line of armored vehicles to scrap metal in a matter of seconds. The SEALs shifted uncomfortably, their ingrained skepticism colliding with the tantalizing possibility that this quiet woman might actually be what she claimed. The captain studied her, his voice dropping even lower. "You're telling me you can get that bird up from this strip right now?" She gave a single, sharp nod. "Yes, it hasn't flown in weeks, but it's airworthy. I know her systems inside and out. I can bring her alive." For a moment, no one moved. The sound of a humming generator from outside filled the silence, along with the distant, rhythmic thud of artillery somewhere far beyond the base's walls. The captain finally stepped closer to her, his boots scraping against the concrete floor. He was a man who had built his entire life on assessing risk, on measuring men and women in seconds, on knowing instinctively who could deliver under pressure and who would crack. He locked eyes with her. "You know what happens if you're wrong," he said, his voice a low growl. "If you can't fly, if you're lying, if you fold under the pressure. My men die tonight. Do you understand that?" Her face didn't change. "I do." The quiet, absolute assurance in her voice unsettled the room. There was no arrogance, no defensiveness, just a simple statement of truth. She wasn't making a promise she couldn't keep. She was stating a fact that she had lived. The SEALs shifted again, this time differently. Doubt was still present, but something else was creeping in alongside it. A reluctant, grudging respect. They had seen countless men boast, brag, and ultimately fail under fire. But rarely had they seen someone stand this calm, this steady, in the face of such a direct challenge. One of the younger operators whispered to another, "If she's really a hog pilot, hell, we might actually have a chance." The captain's jaw flexed. He turned, pacing a short, tense line in the cramped room, then stopped abruptly and faced her again. "All right," he said, the words sharp and final. "Prove it." The room came alive at once. Radios sparked to life, men shifted their gear, and orders were barked. A few SEALs grabbed their rifles and moved toward the exit, preparing to escort her to the runway. The weight of the decision hung heavy, but once the captain gave the word, hesitation had no place. She stepped forward, passing through the circle of hardened operators who still studied her, as though trying to reconcile her ordinary appearance with the extraordinary claim she had just made. Some gave her small, almost imperceptible nods as she passed. Others kept their eyes narrowed, their skepticism still a wall between them. But none of them spoke. As she neared the door, one SEAL muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the men nearby to hear, "Guess we'll see if she's all talk." Another SEAL, older, his face scarred from years of deployments, shook his head. "Doesn't matter what she looks like. If that hog gets airborne, we'll be the ones thanking her." They filed out into the cold desert night. The base was quiet, except for the restless hum of the generators and the distant chatter of gunfire. The stars above stretched out, wide and cold. On the far edge of the runway, faintly illuminated by a pair of sputtering floodlights, the hulking silhouette of the A-10 sat in silence. Its paint was faded, its edges worn, but its presence was unmistakable. The beast was waiting. As they walked, the captain kept his eyes on her, still studying her every movement. She walked with a clear purpose, neither too fast nor too slow, her posture as steady as her voice had been inside the command room. The SEALs followed in a loose formation, their weapons slung but ready, their eyes scanning the dark desert beyond the perimeter. The enemy could strike at any moment, and they all knew that the seconds ticking away were precious. But for the first time since they had retreated to the base, beaten and broken, there was a flicker of something in the air that hadn't been there before. Hope. And it had all started the moment she had quietly risen to her feet. The desert wind pressed against the base walls like a physical force, carrying with it the faint, ominous sounds of conflict from just beyond the perimeter. Every man inside the command bunker knew that the enemy was repositioning, gathering their strength for the next, likely final, strike. Time was not on their side. Yet, inside the room, the tension wasn't just about the enemy outside. It was about the quiet woman who had dared to stand up and claim she could turn the tide. The SEALs had seen their share of specialists before, technicians, engineers, medics, even pilots who would visit their bases briefly before vanishing back into safer, more structured roles. Some of them had earned their respect quickly. Others had faded into the background. But none had ever declared themselves in a moment of such raw desperation as this. She stood by the door now, ready to walk out toward the dark, lonely runway, but the room wasn't quite finished with her. The collective weight of the team's doubt pressed down on her, hard and unforgiving. "Captain," one of the senior chiefs finally spoke up, his voice gravelly and sharp. "We don't even know her name. For all we know, she's been changing batteries and fixing radios since she got here. You're really ready to bet all of our lives on that?" The captain didn't respond immediately. His eyes stayed locked on her, his expression calm but piercing. He wasn't a man who was easily swayed by emotions. He trusted his instincts, instincts that had been honed to a razor's edge through years of brutal combat. Still, he knew his men had a right to their doubts. In their world, trust had to be earned in fire. She didn't wait for the captain to defend her. Instead, she took a single step forward, her voice ringing out, clear and steady. "Captain, I flew 2 tours in Afghanistan. I have over 60 close air support missions under my belt. I've flown in and out of firestorms that most people wouldn't even walk through. I know exactly what it's like to be on the ground, waiting, praying for air cover to arrive. I've been the voice on the other end of that radio, the one that answers those calls." The room quieted. She turned her gaze, sweeping it across the faces of the SEALs, her tone sharper now, cutting through their thick layers of skepticism. "You think I'm just a comms tech? Fine. But right now, none of you can get that hog off the ground. I can. You don't have to like me. You don't even have to believe me. You just have to decide whether you'd rather keep waiting for a rescue that might not come, or take the one chance that is standing right here in front of you. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Some of the younger operators shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado cracking under the sheer weight of her conviction. The senior chief narrowed his eyes, not quite ready to yield. Talk is cheap. We've all heard guys brag about what they've done. Some of them don't come back when it's time to prove it. The captain raised a hand, silencing any further words. He walked toward her slowly, his boots echoing against the concrete floor, and stopped just a few feet away. His eyes searched hers, looking for any hint of hesitation, any flicker of fear, anything at all that might betray her claim. But all he saw was a calm, unshakable certainty. "What's your call sign?" he asked quietly, her lips pressed into a faint, hard line. "Valkyrie." It wasn't said with any dramatic flair, just as a matter of fact. But the name itself carried weight. Call signs weren't chosen. They were earned, given by squadrons to define a pilot's reputation in the sky. The captain had heard hundreds of them over the years. Some were forgettable, but Valkyrie was not a name that was given lightly. A murmur spread through the room. The SEALs exchanged quick, meaningful glances. This was no ordinary pilot. The captain finally gave a single, sharp nod, as if something deep within him had finally been confirmed. "That hog's yours, then." The decision seemed final, but not everyone was ready to accept it so easily. "Sir," the senior chief pressed again, lowering his voice but keeping the hard edge. "You're really going to let her take that plane up? She hasn't even suited up. We've never flown with her. If she screws this up, it's not just her life, it's all of ours." The captain turned on him sharply, his own voice now like a hammer on steel. "Chief, if you've got a better pilot hidden somewhere in your rucksack, you speak up now. Otherwise, you stand down." The chief clenched his jaw, then gave a reluctant nod. The room settled into a heavy, charged silence. The captain's word was final, but the doubt hadn't disappeared entirely. It clung to the air like static, thick and unshakable. She could feel it pressing against her from all sides. The unspoken questions, the deep-seated mistrust, the quiet, cold calculations of men who had survived countless battles by trusting only their own. She didn't resent it. In fact, she understood it. Trust wasn't a gift here, it was forged in fire. But she wasn't here to win their approval. She was here to do a job. "Get me to the runway," she said, her voice firm. Two of the SEALs moved instinctively to flank her, their rifles slung but ready. The captain gestured for the rest of his men to prepare. Radios sparked as messages went out, relaying the audacious decision across the small base. Mechanics stirred from their sleep. Floodlights flickered to life along the makeshift strip, and shadows danced across the hulking frame of the waiting A-10. Still, the doubt lingered as they walked through the narrow corridors toward the open air. Fragments of whispered conversations followed them. "She better be who she says she is. If she is, we might just have a shot. Or she gets herself killed before we're even out the gate." She heard it all, but didn't react. Doubt wasn't new to her. She had felt it the very first time she had walked onto a flight line, the only woman in a squadron of hardened combat pilots. She had felt it the first time she had strapped into a hog and had to prove to her crew chief that she wasn't going to crack under the immense pressure. Doubt was as much a part of combat as bullets or explosions. But doubt had never killed her. Fear had never broken her. And tonight, neither would. When they stepped out into the vast, cold desert night, the sight of the A-10 waiting in silence stirred something deep inside her. The Warthog was battered and scarred from years of hard service, but to her, it was beautiful. Its wide, straight wings stretched out like a predator at rest, its nose heavy with the unmistakable, menacing mouth of the GAU-8 cannon. The sight alone was enough to silence even the loudest skeptic. The SEAL captain stood beside her now, his voice low, meant only for her. "You've got one shot at this, Valkyrie. Make it count." She met his gaze, her own eyes as steady as ever. "I don't miss." Behind them, the men who had doubted her now stood watching, some with their arms crossed, others shifting uneasily. The doubt hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer a matter of simple disbelief. It was now a matter of tense, breathless anticipation. They wanted to see if she would prove them wrong. The engines of the A-10 loomed silent, waiting. And so did the room full of elite warriors whose lives now hung precariously in the balance between doubt and trust. The runway stretched out like a dark, jagged scar across the desert floor. A few faint floodlights lined its cracked and crumbling edges, casting pale, isolated cones of light that barely managed to reach the deep sand beyond. In the distance, the mountains loomed, their peaks black and jagged against the star-dusted sky, a stark reminder of the hostile terrain that was methodically closing in on them. Somewhere out there, in the darkness between those peaks, enemy fighters were regrouping, preparing to press their overwhelming advantage. The SEALs knew they were in a desperate race against time, but for this one suspended moment, all of their eyes were fixed on the hulking shadow at the far end of the strip. The A-10 Thunderbolt sat under a thin veil of camouflage netting, its powerful body weathered and worn, its paint chipped by years of relentless sand and sun. Its engines were quiet, its cockpit dark and empty, as if the great beast were in a deep, unbreakable slumber. To most, it looked like little more than an aging, forgotten relic from another war. But to her, it was something else entirely. It was home. As she walked toward it, the crunch of gravel under her boots sounded unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Two SEALs flanked her, moving with the silent, predatory grace of their training, their eyes constantly scanning the dark desert beyond the perimeter for any sign of a threat. The captain followed several paces behind, his own eyes never leaving her. His men still had their doubts, but his mind was made up. If this woman could somehow breathe life back into that dormant war machine, she would be the only thing standing between his team and complete annihilation. The handful of mechanics stationed on the base had done little more than keep the Hog in a state of mothballs. Its maintenance had been patchwork at best, its complex systems largely neglected. Most of them had assumed it would never see combat again. But as she approached, she could already see the signs that they were wrong. The bird wasn't dead. It was just waiting. She paused at the nose of the aircraft, her gloved hand brushing lightly against the massive cannon that protruded from the front. The GAU-8 Avenger. 7 barrels of rotating steel that could tear through entire columns of tanks, as if they were made of paper. She remembered the first time she had fired it in combat. The raw, bone-shaking vibration that had coursed through her body, the deafening roar that had drowned out everything but her own singular purpose. The ground troops had cheered then, their voices crackling over the radio, their lives saved by the storm of depleted uranium she had unleashed from above. The memory of that moment carried her now. One of the younger SEALs who had been posted nearby with a rifle raised a skeptical brow. "That thing doesn't look like it's flown in months," he muttered. She didn't bother to answer him. Instead, she crouched low, pulling herself up the side ladder with a practiced, fluid ease, her movements so sure and confident it was as though she had performed this exact action 1,000 times before. In truth, she had. Muscle memory took over, each motion deliberate and certain. Inside the cockpit, the air was stale and thick with the scent of old oil and settled dust. She settled into the worn pilot's seat, her hands immediately running across the array of controls. To anyone else, it might have looked like an old, forgotten cockpit, a confusing relic of a bygone era. To her, it was alive with possibility. Her fingertips danced across the switches, levers, and dials like a master pianist reacquainting herself with a long-lost instrument. Below, on the tarmac, the SEALs had gathered in a small, tense group, their long shadows cast across the concrete by the floodlights. They watched her silhouette moving inside the canopy. Some of them crossed their arms, a few shook their heads in lingering disbelief, while others leaned forward, their skepticism slowly giving way to a raw curiosity. The tension was palpable. This was the moment of truth. The captain stepped closer to the nose of the plane, his voice calm but commanding over the rising wind. "How long?" She didn't look down at him. 5 minutes. Maybe less. 5 minutes we don't have, he muttered under his breath. But he didn't stop her. Inside the cockpit, she flipped the main battery switch. The panel in front of her flickered, a few dim lights struggling to come alive. She frowned slightly, then tapped a pressure gauge with her knuckle. The system hummed reluctantly, like a giant being shaken from a deep sleep. She moved with incredible speed, her hands a blur as she tested the hydraulics, the auxiliary power, and the fuel levels. The A-10 groaned and shuddered, but it responded to her touch. "Come on, girl," she whispered softly to the machine. Wake up. One by one, the systems began to light up. The heads-up display flickered with a faint green glow. The radios crackled with faint, promising static. She reached for the throttle, setting the first engine to spool up. Outside, the seals stiffened as the right engine coughed violently, spitting a cloud of smoke and dust into the night air. It whined, faltered for a heart-stopping second, and then finally caught, the massive turbine spinning into a steady, powerful roar. A few of the seals exchanged quick, surprised glances, the first cracks appearing in their wall of skepticism. The second engine followed, coughing less this time, its own roar quickly blending with the first until the entire night air trembled with raw, unrestrained power. Inside the cockpit, she rapidly checked her displays, her eyes moving with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. Everything was functional, or at least functional enough. It wasn't perfect, but in combat, nothing ever was. On the ground, the captain folded his arms, his face still unreadable, but his eyes betrayed the faintest shift. He was watching a true professional at work, someone who didn't need to prove herself with words. She was proving herself with pure, undeniable action. The canopy lowered with a pneumatic hiss, sealing her inside the cockpit. The base lights reflected faintly off the thick glass, her face barely visible behind it, but her expression was as steady as stone. She slid her headset on, flicking to the frequency the seals were using for their ground communications. Control, this is Valkyrie. Systems are green. Engines are hot. Preparing for taxi. The seal standing nearest to the captain nearly dropped his radio, his eyes wide as he stared up at the now-living bird. He muttered, almost to himself, she wasn't lying. The captain allowed the ghost of a smirk to touch his lips. No, he said quietly. She wasn't. The warthog rumbled forward, its heavy wheels grinding against the cracked, uneven runway. The sound reverberated across the small base, drawing the few remaining soldiers and support staff from the shadows to watch. They gathered at the edges of the strip, their own disbelief slowly shifting into a sense of awe. For years, this aircraft had sat forgotten, a silent relic left to gather dust in the harsh desert. Now, under the skilled hands of one determined pilot, it was alive again. Inside the cockpit, her breathing steadied, her hands firm and sure on the controls. She could feel the powerful vibration beneath her, the raw, familiar rhythm of the hog. It was more than just a machine to her. It was a part of her, an extension of everything she had ever trained for, everything she had ever survived. She thought of the men waiting on the ground, the hardened seals whose eyes had bored into her with doubt only minutes earlier. She thought of their captain, of his silent challenge and his quiet demand for proof. And she thought of the enemy, waiting just beyond the mountains, confident that they had trapped America's most elite warriors. Not tonight. Her voice came cool and steady over the comms, cutting through the deafening roar of the engines. Valkyrie to ground. Let's go hunting. The seals on the tarmac stood frozen for a moment, the raw reality of the situation finally sinking in. The captain finally spoke, his voice low but carrying with a new authority across the group. Mount up. She's in the fight. As the A-10 taxied down the strip, dust and heat rising in its powerful wake, the heavy doubt that had filled the command room just hours earlier began to fade. In its place grew something stronger, something the SEALs hadn't allowed themselves to feel since their mission had gone so terribly wrong. Faith. The hog was alive, and so was their chance. The night air quaked with the low, guttural growl of the engines as the A-10 Thunderbolt taxied toward the edge of the makeshift runway. Dust and superheated air plumed around its thick tires, the desert's dry breath mixing with the acrid smell of jet exhaust. To the SEALs standing watch on the tarmac, the sight was nothing short of surreal. This ancient, battle-scarred machine, brought back to life by a pilot no one had expected, now thundered forward with a palpable sense of purpose. Inside the cockpit, she tightened her grip on the throttles, her gloved fingers moving with a rhythm that had been ingrained in her by years of relentless training. The hog was old and stubborn, but it was obedient in her hands. Every dial, every flickering display on the instrument panel, spoke to her like an old friend she had rediscovered after years apart. Her voice came cool and composed over the comms channel. Valkyrie to ground. Rolling in 5. The SEAL captain raised his radio to his lips, his own voice answering with the steadiness of a man who had seen countless battles but understood the unique gravity of this one. "Valkyrie, this is Hammer 1. Godspeed." The nose of the hog pointed toward the dark, menacing horizon. Ahead, the runway stretched out like a narrow, crumbling bridge into the deep uncertainty of the night. Beyond those jagged mountain peaks, the enemy was massing, hundreds of fighters who were convinced they had the SEALs cornered, defenseless, and ready for annihilation. She eased the throttles forward. The engines roared, spitting twin streams of fire into the darkness. The entire airframe trembled, then surged ahead, its tires screeching in protest against the cracked asphalt. Her body was pressed back hard into the seat as the powerful acceleration clawed at her chest. At 100 knots, the nose of the aircraft began to lift. At 130, the tires screamed their final farewell to the earth and left the ground. The hog, heavy and broad-winged, climbed into the vast desert night with a roaring defiance that seemed almost alive. The SEALs on the ground tilted their heads skyward, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. Some of them cheered under their breath. Others clenched their fists in a surge of raw, visceral relief. For the first time in hours, hope was no longer a fragile, abstract thing. It had shape, it had wings, and it had teeth. On the other side of the mountains, meanwhile, the main SEAL team, pinned down in a narrow, rocky valley, was fighting a desperate battle, tooth and nail. Their defensive position had eroded hour by hour under the enemy's relentless assault. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Enemy mortar rounds pounded the ridges around them, dirt and fire erupting with a bone-rattling force that shook the very ground they stood on. Lieutenant Cross, the ground team's second-in-command, was crawled behind a battered rock wall, the radio pressed tightly to his ear. The hiss of static mixed with fragments of comms chatter that he could barely piece together. He shouted into the mic over the deafening crack of gunfire. "Hammer Base, this is Hammer 2. We are at our breaking point. If we don't get air support in the next 5 minutes, we are done out here." The answer that came through was not what he expected. It was a steady, cool, female voice. "Copy that, Hammer 2. Valkyrie is inbound. ETA 3 minutes." Cross blinked, his dirt-streaked face etched with utter disbelief. He hadn't expected anyone to make it airborne from that desolate FOB, let alone this fast. He looked over at his men, exhausted, bloodied, but still firing with grim determination. A spark of something that had long been absent flared in his chest. "She's coming," he muttered into the team's private comms. "Hold the line. She's coming." High in the skies, the hog leveled off at a low altitude, its silhouette hugging the dark terrain. Her eyes flicked constantly between the terrain-following display and the menacing mountains that loomed ahead. She knew every bump and shift of this machine. She trusted it like she trusted the beat of her own heart. Her heads-up display lit up with green symbology, painting targets on her screen. Multiple heat signatures were clustered around the valley where the SEALs were trapped. She could almost feel the desperation radiating up from the embattled team below. She thumbed the weapon systems live. A series of switches clicked into readiness. The beast was arming itself for war. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon hummed with an almost ominous vibration directly beneath her feet. Her voice cut through the comms, clear and resolute. "Valkyrie is on station. Hammer 2, mark your position with smoke." Below, a SEAL popped a red smoke grenade, its thick plume trailing upward through the darkness like a flare of blood against the night sky. She spotted it instantly, her eyes narrowing with focus. Visual confirmed. Stand by for fire. On her first run, the hog dipped low, hugging the ridgeline, then banked sharply and dove into the valley. The ground below immediately lit up with tracer fire, streams of glowing red arcing up toward her like furious, angry spears. She felt the sharp rattle of impacts peppering her armor, but the hog was built for this. It could take punishment like no other aircraft in the world. She aligned her crosshairs on a tight cluster of enemy vehicles that were surrounding the SEAL's perimeter. With steady, practiced hands, she squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared to life. A solid stream of depleted uranium rounds tore through the night sky, molten sparks shredding into the enemy's armor and tearing the valley floor apart in a maelstrom of destruction. Explosions blossomed in fiery, violent eruptions. Silhouettes of fighters were flung into the air like rag dolls. On the ground, the seals ducked as the sky itself seemed to open up and rain down fire. Their enemies, once bold and advancing, scattered in sheer panic under the relentless, terrifying storm. Cross shouted into his radio, his voice hoarse but triumphant. "Direct hit, Valkyrie. That's beautiful work. Enemy is in disarray." But the enemy was not broken yet. From concealed positions on the ridges, they fired back with anti-air weapons, streaks of missiles cutting through the darkness. Alarms screamed in her cockpit as the Hog's countermeasure system lit up. She yanked the stick hard, banking violently to the left, the bulky aircraft rolling with a surprising agility. A spray of flares spat from her wings, burning bright against the black sky. A missile that had locked onto her suddenly veered off, fooled by the intense heat signature. Another one screamed past her right wing, missing by mere inches. Her jaw was clenched, sweat beading on her brow. This was not going to be easy. "They're still up," she radioed calmly, though her pulse was racing. Lining up for another run. From the valley floor, the seals watched as the Hog circled back, its massive, dark silhouette stark against the moonlight. One of the younger operators, bleeding from a fresh cut across his temple, whispered in awe, "Holy hell, she's not letting up." Cross reloaded his rifle, a feral grin spreading across his face despite his exhaustion. "She's buying us time. Don't waste it. Pour it on them." The SEALs' rifles cracked in response. Grenades thumped in the distance. The team surged with a renewed, desperate energy, pushing the enemy back inch by bloody inch. The tide was turning, but only if the Valkyrie could stay in the fight. On her second run, she came in even lower this time, skimming the treetops. Her targeting reticle locked onto a mortar team that was setting up on a high ridge. She fired again, the cannon ripping their position apart in a chain of secondary detonations. Smoke and fire rose in thick columns, painting the valley in a hellish, flickering light. The enemy fighters broke in confusion, some retreating into the darkness, others desperately firing their small arms uselessly into the sky. The Hog thundered overhead, its engines screaming like a predator in the night. Inside the cockpit, she kept her voice steady and controlled. "Hammer 2, I'm seeing a corridor opening up to the north. Push your men in that direction. I will clear you a path." Cross didn't hesitate. "You heard the lady. Move, move, move." The SEALs began shifting, leapfrogging from cover to cover, advancing through the narrow gap she was carving for them with pure, unadulterated firepower. With every run she made, she pushed the enemy further back. With every burst of rounds she fired, she widened the gap between their defeat and their survival. The valley, which had once been a tomb waiting to close on the SEALs, was now a battlefield being rewritten by her will. Her body ached from the strain, her ears rang from the roar of the cannon, but her focus never wavered for an instant. The Hog was more than just a plane tonight. It was a shield, a sword, and a thunderous declaration that the SEALs would not die in this valley. As she pulled up from her third run, the captain's voice broke over the comms from the base, calm, but carrying an immense weight. "Valkyrie, you just changed the game." She exhaled slowly, her eyes fixed on the burning valley below. The mission was far from over. But for the first time since this nightmare had begun, the SEALs had a fighting chance. And she wasn't done yet. The valley burned like a furnace, thick plumes of black smoke curling into the night sky, red embers swirling in the hot desert wind. The cacophony of constant gunfire, the thud of mortar blasts, and the deafening roar of the jet engines all collided into a single, overwhelming storm of sound and fury. At the very center of it all was the A-10 Thunderbolt, circling low and menacingly, the predator that had turned certain defeat into a sliver of opportunity. For the SEALs pinned down below, it was like watching the hand of God itself carving up the battlefield. Every single run the Warthog made sent the enemy formations scattering like ants under a stream of boiling water. Every brutal burst from its monstrous cannon made the ground itself quake with a primal violence. Lieutenant Cross, his face streaked with dirt and grime, shouted over the radio, his voice raw but charged with a wild exhilaration. "Valkyrie, you're tearing them apart. Keep it coming." From her cockpit, she didn't waste words. Her eyes remained glued to the heads-up display, her targeting reticles locking onto one cluster of targets after another. Her hands were steady on the controls, her breathing measured and calm. She didn't hear the cheers, the sounds of awe, or the disbelief from the men below. All she heard was the hog, the beast purring with deadly potential under her complete command. "Copy, Hammer 2," she replied evenly. "Next run is inbound." She banked the aircraft sharply, the G-forces pulling hard against her body. The world tilted, the valley spinning beneath her wings. In the faint, eerie moonlight, she saw them. The enemy, desperately trying to regroup, to push back against the American operators who now had the one thing they didn't: air cover. Trucks with mounted guns scrambled into new firing positions. A technical truck loaded with crude rockets pointed its payload skyward. Fighters swarmed like angry hornets from behind a rocky outcrop, their muzzle flashes a furious, desperate protest against her dominance. She lined them all up in her sights. Her fingers squeezed the trigger. BRRT. The Hog's cannon ripped through the night again, a torrent of high-explosive shells raining down with merciless, surgical precision. The technical truck exploded in a thunderous fireball of flame, its rockets detonating prematurely and chaining across the ridgeline in a spectacular cascade of destruction. Enemy fighters were cut down mid-sprint, their bodies torn apart by the sheer fury she had unleashed from above. The ground quaked, the air reverberated, and in that single, violent instant, the balance of power on the battlefield shifted completely. On the ground, the SEALs moved with a newfound vigor. They were no longer just surviving. They were advancing. Every time the Hog strafed overhead, they surged forward through the thick smoke and wreckage, reclaiming ground inch by hard-won inch. "Push north. Use the corridor she's carving for us." Cross bellowed, firing off controlled bursts from his own rifle. His operators leaped from cover to cover, laying down suppressive fire, tossing grenades into the bunkers that were still occupied. The relentless air strikes had shattered the enemy's rhythm. Now, the SEALs were dictating the pace of the fight. One young SEAL, his helmet smeared with ash, stopped just long enough to watch the Hog scream past directly overhead, its engines a deafening roar. His voice was filled with a raw, almost reverent awe. "That sound, it's like death itself." Cross grabbed him by the shoulder, dragging him forward. "Don't stop moving. She's giving us a gift. Don't you dare waste it." From the cockpit, she could see the entire battle unfolding below her like a living map. The SEALs were pressing out of the choke point, their formation spreading, their movements sharper and more confident. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were winning. But victory demanded more. She spotted a heavy machine gun emplacement dug into the side of a ridge, a fortified nest with a belt-fed weapon that was sweeping deadly arcs of fire across the valley floor. It had pinned several SEALs down behind a cluster of large rocks. If they stayed there, they'd be slaughtered. If they moved, they'd be cut down. Her jaw set. She banked the Hog hard, lining up her shot. "Hang tight, Hammer 2, she said into the comms. "I've got that nest." She swooped low, almost skimming the top of the ridge. Her cannon roared again. The fortified position simply evaporated under the assault. Sandbags were torn open, steel supports were twisted into unrecognizable shapes, and bodies were flung from the position. The SEALs wasted no time, surging forward into the newly created gap. "Target destroyed," she called out, her voice still calm, though her pulse was racing from the maneuver. Cross's reply came through, ragged but triumphant. "You're rewriting this battlefield, Valkyrie. Keep that fire raining down." But the enemy was far from finished. Two long smoke trails lanced upward from hidden positions on the opposing ridge. Surface-to-air missiles. The cockpit screamed with alarms, red lights flashing frantically across her displays. She reacted instantly. Flares shot out from her wings in a brilliant burst of heat and fire, streaking across the night sky like falling stars. She dove the Hog hard, its engines roaring, her body slammed against the seat as the plane screamed toward the earth. One of the missiles veered off, exploding harmlessly in the distance. The other one stayed locked on her. "Come on," she muttered, yanking the stick hard, rolling the heavy bird in a desperate, evasive maneuver. She fired another burst of flares, banking violently. The missile chased her, closed in, and then streaked past her wingtip, fooled at the very last second. It detonated behind her in a thunderous, blinding bloom of light. The hog shook violently from the shockwave, but it held together. The old bird wasn't just flying, it was enduring. Her breathing steadied. "Still up," she reported curtly, engaging remaining targets on the ground. The seals had watched the near miss from below, their hearts seizing in their chests for an instant as they thought she might be gone. When the hog steadied, circling back with its engines howling, a fresh wave of adrenaline surged through them. "She's unkillable," one of them muttered in awe. Cross allowed himself a grim smile. "No, she's just that good." They moved again, firing with a renewed fury, every man on the ground feeding off the storm she was creating above them. The enemy fighters, who had once been so confident in their superior numbers, now broke ranks. Fear was evident in their chaotic movements. They weren't hunting anymore. They were being hunted. On her next run, she banked, her eyes narrowing on the last major concentration of vehicles at the northern end of the valley, armored trucks, supply caches, and the fighters who were regrouping for a desperate last stand. This was the keystone of their remaining force. Destroy it, and the SEALs would have a clear path out. Her targeting system locked on. Her finger hovered over the trigger. She exhaled slowly, her world narrowing to a single point of intense focus. The GAU-8 roared one more time, its thunder echoing across the valley like the wrath of a god. Shells tore through the vehicles, detonating fuel tanks in a massive chain reaction. Fireballs erupted one after another, the blast wave rippling across the entire battlefield. The remaining enemy fighters fled in every direction, their formation completely shattered. Below, the SEALs surged forward. Cross shouted into his radio, his voice fierce with triumph. "Valkyrie just opened the door for us. Move now." The operators sprinted through the corridor of wreckage she had carved, their weapons blazing, their precision fire cutting down any stragglers. Smoke and fire cloaked their movements, giving them the cover they so desperately needed. What had been a desperate last stand just minutes earlier was now a full-scale breakout. The hog overhead kept circling, punishing any enemy foolish enough to try and regroup. The men moved with a renewed purpose, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten, pushed aside by the sheer momentum of victory. Every man knew that without the fire from above, this valley would have been their grave. Inside the cockpit, she felt none of their celebration. Her world remained the HUD, the horizon, the constant buzz of alarms and weapon systems. Sweat dripped down her temple, her body aching from the strain of the constant high-G maneuvers. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until every single one of them was out. Her voice, calm as ever, cut through the comms. "Hammer 2, the corridor is secure. Push north. I'll cover you until the last man is clear." Cross's reply was fierce, his gratitude buried beneath the urgency of the moment. "Copy that, Valkyrie. We're moving." The valley was transformed. What had begun as a death trap for America's most elite warriors was now a burning monument to their survival. Wrecked vehicles smoldered, ammunition cooked off and scattered, popping bursts, and the enemy lay broken across the sand. The valley was no longer their stronghold, it was their graveyard. The hog circled above, its engines howling, its guns ready. To the SEALs, its shadow was salvation itself. To the enemy, it was doom incarnate. And at its controls sat the quiet pilot who had risen to her feet to answer a question that no one had ever thought she could. The fire from above had not just saved their lives. It had rewritten their destiny. The valley was no longer quiet. It pulsed with the rhythmic crackle of fire and the lingering echoes of chaos, a dying roar of a battle that had been decisively won. The A-10's relentless strikes had not just shattered the enemy's confidence. They had shattered their entire force. But the fight was not over, not yet. Victory here meant more than just killing the enemy. It meant survival. And survival for the SEALs depended on one last thing: getting out of that valley alive. High above the swirling smoke and smoldering wreckage, the hog circled like a vigilant predator refusing to release its prey from its sight. Inside the cockpit, her eyes scanned the battlefield, her heads-up display glowing a steady green against the dark interior. She could see the SEALs' positions, now marked by intermittent red smoke, their movements coordinated but still desperate. She could also see what lay ahead of them: the enemy's last choke point, a heavily fortified position dug in across the northern corridor. Trenches, makeshift barricades, and heavy machine gun emplacements blocked the only viable route out of the valley. Dozens of fighters still held that ground, their fire now more disciplined, their numbers still greater than the weary team below could hope to overcome without her direct support. She pressed the radio transmit button, her voice clipped but calm. Hammer 2, this is Valkyrie. You've got hard resistance at the northern exit. I am going to clear the corridor. Move only when I give the word. On the ground, Lieutenant Cross crouched behind the smoking husk of a destroyed vehicle, his rifle pressed tightly to his shoulder. His men were bloodied, exhausted, and running critically low on ammunition. Yet, when her voice cut through the static of his radio, something inside him steadied. He keyed his mic. Copy that, Valkyrie. We'll hold our position until you call it. He looked over at his men, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, their eyes burning with a deep, primal exhaustion. She's carving us a way out, he told them. Keep your heads low. When she clears it, we run like hell. For her first strike on the new position, the Hog dropped low, its wide wings spread, its engines screaming a defiant roar. She aligned her reticle on the first barricade, an emplacement that was bristling with heavy machine guns. Her finger curled around the trigger. BRRRT. The cannon spat a storm of fire and steel, tearing the barricade apart in a shower of wood and sand. Gunmen were thrown from their positions, the very earth ripped open by the sheer force of the torrent. A series of secondary explosions rocked the trench line as the enemy's ammunition ignited. She pulled the Hog up sharply, banking hard to avoid the inevitable incoming fire. Her displays flashed with warnings, small arms fire peppering the armor, the telltale smoke trails of RPGs arcing upward. But the Hog endured. First nest is down, she radioed, her voice still steady. 2 more to go. The SEALs waited below. Cross ducked as debris rained down around him, watching the first barricade simply vanish in a cloud of fire and smoke. For a moment, he almost forgot his own exhaustion, a grim smile spreading across his face. He keyed the mic. Copy that, Valkyrie. That's one hell of a hole you just punched for us. Beside him, a young operator with shaking hands fumbled to jam another magazine into his rifle. Sir, do you really think we're going to get out of this? Cross clapped him on the shoulder, forcing a tone of unshakable steel into his own voice. Look up, son. She's still flying. As long as she's up there, we are going home. The men nodded, their collective faith clinging to the dark silhouette that was circling above them like a guardian angel. She banked again for the second barricade, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the next stronghold, a reinforced concrete bunker that had been carved directly into the ridge itself. RPG fire lanced upward from it, long smoke trails cutting through the night. She fired off a burst of flares, diving low, her body slammed by the G-forces. The Hog rattled violently, alarms screaming in her ears, but she held steady, meticulously lining up the shot. The cannon thundered again, a relentless storm of 30mm rounds hammering against the bunker. The concrete crumbled, and the gunfire from within sputtered out. A final, massive explosion ripped the structure open, bright flames consuming the entire ridge in an instant. She climbed hard, her teeth gritted, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Hog shuddered from the strain, but it stayed aloft. Second position neutralized, she called out, her voice a little sharper now, betraying the immense physical and mental strain she was under. Corridor is opening. Stand by. But the enemy wasn't done yet. From the far end of the corridor, a technical truck rolled forward, its heavy machine gun spitting a continuous stream of fire down the narrow path. Behind it, a group of fighters regrouped, pouring into the gap with a renewed, desperate fury. They knew exactly what she was doing, carving a path for the SEALs, and they were determined to die before they let it happen. On the ground, Cross saw the movement, and his blood ran cold. They're plugging the corridor again. Valkyrie, we need that truck gone now. She was already diving. The Hog screamed toward the earth, her targeting reticle locking onto the truck. She fired. The cannon shredded it in half, the resulting explosion hurling bodies in all directions. She then strafed through the fighters who had been following it, her rounds cutting wide swaths in the sand. When the dust and smoke cleared, nothing was left standing. The path lay open. Her voice crackled through the comms, hoarse but commanding. The corridor is clear. Move now. Go. Cross didn't hesitate. He turned to his men, his roar carrying through the chaos. Go. Move north now. She's given us our shot. Take it. The SEALs surged forward, sprinting through the thick smoke and flickering fire. They leaped over wreckage, fired off short bursts at any remaining stragglers, and dragged their wounded comrades by their vests. Every step forward was an act of survival. Every breath was one stolen from the jaws of certain defeat. Above them, the hog circled relentlessly, strafing any enemy force that dared to regroup. The roar of its engines became their war cry, its heavy, dark mass a shield between them and death. One SEAL stumbled, hit in the leg. Another immediately dropped beside him, hauling him up. Not leaving you, brother. Keep moving. Together, they limped through the burning valley, guided by the constant thunder overhead. Cross ran with them, his chest heaving, his rifle spitting rounds. He keyed his mic mid-sprint. Valkyrie, we're in the corridor. Don't let them cut us off. From the far end of the valley, the last remnants of the enemy force gathered in a final act of desperation. Mortar tubes were dragged into place. RPGs were hoisted on his shoulders. It was their final gamble to close the trap before the SEALs could break free. She saw it instantly. Her HUD lit up with hostile signatures clustering at the very exit of the corridor. If they fired into that narrow space now, the SEALs would be slaughtered. Her voice hardened. Hammer 2, hold your line. Engaging the final cluster. She banked so steeply that the wings of the hog were almost vertical. She dove into the mouth of the corridor and unleashed hell. The cannon roared one final time, long streams of fire lacerating the ground. The mortar crews vanished in bursts of dirt and flame. The RPG teams disintegrated in mid-movement. The enemy finally broke apart in sheer terror, those who survived fleeing into the dark mountains. She pulled up, the engine screaming, the hog's silhouette blotting out the stars for an instant. When she leveled off, nothing remained at the corridor's end but fire and silence. The SEALs burst through the smoke and into the open desert, stumbling but alive. The cool night wind hit their faces, a welcome relief from the furnace they had just left behind. For the first time in hours, there was space to breathe. Cross slowed, rallying his men as they regrouped beyond the kill zone. He keyed his mic, his voice ragged with a gratitude that was almost too profound to put into words. Valkyrie, corridor is secure. We are clear. There was a long pause. Then her reply came, steady despite her own exhaustion. Copy that, Hammer 2. I'll watch your 6 until exfil arrives. Keep moving. The men collapsed briefly into the sand, sucking in deep lungfuls of air. Some were laughing, some were crying, their bodies battered, bleeding, and worn down to the bone, but they were alive. As they pushed deeper into the desert toward their designated extraction point, the hog remained above them, circling endlessly. Its engines growled like a guardian that refused to leave its charge. The SEALs marched under its protective shadow, each man knowing that they would never forget this night, this pilot, or the fire from above that had carved their salvation from the jaws of death. And though she sat alone in the cockpit, drenched in sweat, her body aching with a deep, pervasive exhaustion, her eyes never wavered from the dark horizon. She would not rest until every last one of them was out. The corridor had been opened. It was now their road to freedom. The desert night had begun to ease its grip, the deep indigo of the sky slowly softening as the first, faint hints of pre-dawn light crept over the distant horizon. The SEALs moved steadily, though their pace was slow and deliberate, toward the extraction point. The valley, now a smoldering, silent graveyard of enemy forces, lay far behind them, the only sound the occasional, distant crackle of remaining fires. High above, the A-10 thundered with a presence that was both protective and relentless. The hog had guided them through death and back, and now it circled the perimeter of their movement, a vigilant guardian ensuring that the enemy had no chance of mounting a final, desperate ambush. Lieutenant Cross, leading his operators through the rocky terrain, stole a glance upward. The massive, dark shadow against the pale, early morning sky was more than just a machine to him now. It was salvation made tangible, a creature of roaring wings and steel jaws that had clawed his team back from certain defeat. He keyed his radio, his voice still hoarse but filled with a deep, quiet reverence. Valkyrie, status. Her voice cut through the static, as calm and unwavering as it had been at the start of the battle, despite the hours of intense combat. Engine stable. Cover is complete. Exfil point is 5 minutes ahead of you. Cross allowed himself a slow, deep exhale. Their path to extraction was finally clear. The faces of his men reflected their profound exhaustion, but underneath it all, a fierce, grateful glow shone in their eyes. None of them had truly expected to survive the night. She guided the hog low, skimming the desert floor as if the plane itself understood the fragility of this final moment. The wind tore against her canopy, whistling through the battle-scarred fuselage, carrying the lingering scent of burned earth and spent ammunition. Her hands were steady, each input on the controls precise and measured. Her mind was focused entirely on ensuring their safe exit. From the ground, the SEALs watched her, some leaning on one another for support, others kneeling briefly to catch their breath. All of them were acutely aware of the life-or-death precision of her flight. A single miscalculation, a moment of hesitation, and their extraction point could be compromised. The faint, blinking glow of the extraction chopper finally appeared on the horizon, circling into position. Valkyrie keyed her mic again. Hammer 2, you are clear for extraction. I will maintain overwatch until you are on board. Cross's reply was simple, terse, and heavy with an emotion he couldn't fully express. Copy that. God bless you, Valkyrie. Even as the SEALs reached the designated landing zone, small pockets of enemy resistance lingered in the surrounding ridges, desperate teams trying to mount one last, futile interference. Valkyrie dove the hog low, strafing any potential threats with surgical precision. Tracer rounds zipped past her canopy, but the hog absorbed them, its armored frame deflecting what would have shredded a lesser aircraft. On the ground, Cross and his team sprinted the final 100 meters to the waiting chopper, its rotors kicking up a storm of sand and dust that stung their eyes and lips. Some men carried their wounded comrades. Others had faces streaked with soot and blood. They didn't look like the elite warriors they were. They looked human, exhausted, grateful, and they owed their very lives to the woman in the hog. She executed another punishing run, taking out a last, hidden squad of fighters that had been trying to flank the extraction zone. The cannon spat fire one final time, and the enemy position simply disappeared, their resistance broken and disorganized. Only then did she signal the SEALs to proceed. One by one, the operators climbed aboard the waiting helicopter. The noise was deafening, but the relief was palpable. Cross climbed on last, scanning the valley behind them one final time before settling inside. Valkyrie, we are all aboard, he called out over the comms. Her voice came back, steady and measured, yet tinged with the faintest hint of relief. Copy that. Hog is stable, standing by for your final lift. The extraction pilot acknowledged the hog's overwatch, and as the helicopter lifted off the ground, Valkyrie made one final, sweeping pass over the valley, ensuring the area was clear of any potential threats. Her eyes swept over the wreckage, the scorched earth, the bodies of the enemy scattered and broken across the sand. Victory had come at a heavy price, but at least the SEALs were alive. The hog banked, its engines screaming in a triumphant, almost mournful roar, before turning back toward the distant, lonely runway of the forward operating base. The hog's wheels kissed the cracked runway with a controlled, expert precision. Dust and sand spiraled around the tires as she brought the massive aircraft to a smooth, gentle stop. She cut the engines, and the deep, thunderous rumble faded into an almost shocking silence. The SEALs, now safely back at the base, emerged from the helicopter, still on high alert, but finally allowing their weary bodies to begin to relax. Cross stepped forward first, his boots crunching against the loose gravel. He didn't speak at first. He merely stood and watched her climb down from the cockpit, her flight suit smeared with soot, her gloves worn, her face streaked with sweat, but her eyes still as unyielding as ever. The entire base fell quiet. Not a single word was spoken. It was the kind of profound silence that carried an immense weight, the kind that acknowledged a shared, life-altering experience without needing applause or celebration. Finally, the SEAL captain, the one who had first asked the desperate question hours ago, walked forward. His boots echoed against the concrete. Every man present turned to watch. He stopped directly in front of her. There was no need for ceremony, no need for effusive words of praise. He simply nodded once. Then, in a gesture that left the entire team still and reverent, he saluted her. She returned it, brief, crisp, and equal in its profound respect. The team seemed to exhale collectively, a shared release of tension. Cross approached, still breathing heavily, and finally found his voice. "Ma'am, I don't think any of us can ever thank you enough." She shook her head slightly, her body language conveying her own exhaustion, but her spirit was unwavering. "Don't thank me. Just keep your heads down and stay sharp. That's what matters." Another operator, one of the younger ones, spoke up, his eyes wide with an awe he couldn't contain. You just saved all of us. Every last one. I don't know how to." She cut him off gently, her voice calm. "By standing up when I was asked. That's all it took. That's all any of us can ever do. The rest is just doing your job." There was a long pause. Then the captain, who had been watching silently, spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. "Tonight, we all learned something. Appearances don't matter. Doubt doesn't matter. What matters is action. And you, Valkyrie, you proved that beyond any shadow of a doubt." She nodded, letting the weight of that acknowledgement finally settle upon her. It was rare in war to earn respect so quietly, without words, without fanfare. And tonight, she had earned it in spades. The sun rose fully over the desert, its light revealing the true extent of the night's battle. A thin line of smoke from the valley drifted eastward on the morning breeze, carrying with it the stench of spent weapons and fire. But within the base, the mood was one of quiet, somber reflection. Men who had stared death directly in the face just hours earlier were alive, breathing, moving, and whole. She walked toward the hangar, her helmet tucked under her arm, her boots feeling heavy against the gravel. The SEALs lingered for a moment, watching her go, then returned to their duties, each of them changed forever by the presence of the pilot who had answered a call that no one thought could be answered. The captain remained where he was, still watching the Hog's long shadow stretch across the runway in the morning light. Finally, he exhaled and muttered to himself, almost inaudibly, "She's one of us now." And in that simple, powerful statement lay more respect than any medal could ever confer, more honor than any ceremony could ever bestow. The room, the base, and the men within it finally understood. Sometimes, heroism doesn't roar for applause. Sometimes, it rises quietly, answers a question, and saves lives in silence. Tonight, Valkyrie had done exactly that.